The first mistake I made that night was whispering a curse in Sicilian under my breath. The second was assuming the man at the corner table wouldn't understand it. The restaurant smelled like garlic, butter, and expensive wine, the kind that came in bottles taller than my forearm and cost more than my monthly rent. Friday nights at Bellini's were always packed, but tonight felt different. Quieter in the wrong places. Louder in the wrong ways. The kind of tension you could feel even if nobody said a word. I balanced a tray of glasses against my hip and moved between tables, pretending I wasn't watching the group in the back corner. For men, dark suits, perfect posture, the kind of people who didn't wait for service. Service came to them. The one in the center barely spoke. He didn't have to. Everyone else seemed to orbit him like he was gravity itself. Tall, broad shoulders under a tailored charcoal jacket. Dark hair brushed back neatly, the kind of haircut that probably cost more than my phone bill. His expression was calm, almost bored, but there was something about the way the room shifted around him that made my stomach tighten. People noticed him without meaning to. Conversations softened when he looked their way. Even the bartender moved faster when refilling his glass. I didn't know his name yet, but I knew exactly what he was. Powerful, dangerous in the quiet way. The kind of man who never needed to raise his voice. I set down 2 plates at table 12, nodded politely, and turned back toward the kitchen when I heard the sharp tone of a snapped command behind me. It came from the corner table. Not loud, not angry, just firm enough to make the young busboy freeze in place. The kid looked like he couldn't be older than 19. Skinny, nervous, probably working 2 jobs like everyone else in this city. He'd spilled water while refilling their glasses. Just a few drops on the white tablecloth. Nothing serious. But the entire table had gone silent. The man at the center leaned back slowly in his chair, studying the busboy like he was reading a page in a book. No shouting. No threats. Just that look. The kid started apologizing too fast, words tripping over each other, hands shaking while he dabbed the table with a napkin. My chest tightened watching it. I'd seen that look before. People with too much power loved moments like this. Loved reminding the world who was in charge. I turned toward the kitchen and muttered under my breath before I could stop myself. A short, sharp sentence in Sicilian. Something my grandmother used to say whenever someone acted like they owned the world. I didn't say it loudly, barely more than a whisper, just enough to release the frustration burning in my chest. Because no one here spoke Sicilian. Not in Midtown Manhattan. Not in a restaurant full of investment bankers and tourists. At least, that's what I thought. I had just pushed through the swinging kitchen door when I heard a chair scrape across the marble floor behind me. The sound cut through the restaurant like a blade. Conversations paused. Glasses stopped halfway to lips. I froze with my hand on the door handle. Then a voice spoke behind me. Calm. Smooth. Amused. Say that again. My heart skipped once. I turned slowly. The man from the corner table was standing now, tall enough that the chandelier light caught the edges of his dark hair. He wasn't angry. Not even close. He was smiling. Not a big smile. Just a small curve at the corner of his mouth, like he'd just heard the most interesting thing all night. His eyes locked onto mine with quiet precision. But this time, he said softly, "Say it while looking at me." For a moment nobody moved. I could hear the faint clink of a fork touching porcelain somewhere behind me and the low hum of the air conditioner above the bar. That was it. No music. No chatter. Just the quiet weight of an entire restaurant suddenly paying attention. My hand was still on the kitchen door handle. The metal felt cold against my palm. I told myself to keep walking. Just push the door open, disappear into the kitchen, and pretend I had not heard him. But something about the way he said those words stopped me. Not anger. Not threat. Curiosity. Like he had just discovered a puzzle he intended to solve. I turned slowly. The man stood about 10 feet away from me now, hands resting loosely in the pockets of his jacket, shoulders relaxed like this was the most ordinary moment in the world. His 3 companions remained seated behind him, but every one of them was watching me with the same quiet attention. The busboy had completely frozen, napkin still clutched in his hand. The manager stood near the bar looking like he had forgotten how to breathe. The man's eyes never left mine. Dark eyes. Calm eyes. The kind that missed nothing. "I did not hear you clearly," he said, his voice smooth and controlled. "What was it you said in Sicilian?" My stomach dropped. He understood it. Every word. Of course he did. I considered lying. Pretending I had said something else. Pretending I did not even know Sicilian. But the look in his eyes told me that would not work. He had already heard it, already understood it, already decided what to do with it. My grandmother used to say that when you spoke the truth you had to stand by it, even when it made life difficult. Especially then. I released the kitchen door slowly and stepped back into the dining room. My sneakers sounded louder than they should have against the marble floor. One step, then another. The distance between us closed until I was standing only a few feet away from him. Up close he was even taller than I had thought. At least 6'3". The faint scent of cedar and something expensive hung in the air around him. Not overwhelming, just present enough to remind you he was not like everyone else in the room. His head tilted slightly as he studied my face, like he was trying to memorize it. "Go on," he said quietly. "You had something to say." I crossed my arms without meaning to. A defensive habit I had picked up years ago working late shifts in places like this. "You want me to repeat it?" I asked. The corner of his mouth lifted again, that same small, amused smile. "Yes," he said, "but this time you will look at me when you say it." The room somehow grew even quieter. I could feel every pair of eyes in the restaurant moving between us like they were watching a tennis match. My heart was beating fast, but my voice came out steady. I looked directly into his eyes and repeated the exact same Sicilian phrase I had whispered earlier, the words rolling off my tongue the way they had 1,000 times in my grandmother's kitchen. Growing up in Queens. For a second nothing happened. Not a reaction. Not a breath. Then something completely unexpected occurred. The man laughed. Not loudly. Not wildly. Just a short, genuine laugh that seemed to surprise even the men sitting at his table. He shook his head slightly and looked at me again, this time with a spark of interest that had not been there before. "That," he said slowly, "is the first honest thing anyone has said to me all evening." The sound of his laughter lingered in the air longer than it should have. Not loud. Not mocking. Just real enough to make the entire room look even more confused. I blinked once, trying to decide if I had just imagined it. The three men at his table exchanged quick glances with each other like they had never seen that reaction before. The busboy slowly lowered the napkin in his hand, still staring at me like I had just stepped onto a stage I did not belong on. The man in front of me studied my face for another second, the faint smile still resting at the corner of his mouth. "What is your name?" he asked. The question caught me off guard. I had expected anger. Maybe a sharp comment. Something that reminded everyone exactly who he was. But not that. "Clara," I answered before I could stop myself. "Clara Bennett." His eyes narrowed slightly, not in suspicion but in thought, like he was storing the name somewhere important. "Clara," he repeated slowly, testing the sound of it. Then he nodded once as if confirming something only he understood. "Tell me something, Clara Bennett." His voice remained calm, almost conversational now, but the room still held its breath around us. "Do you always insult strangers in languages you believe they do not understand?" A few quiet chuckles slipped from somewhere behind me, quickly swallowed by the heavy silence that followed. I felt heat rise in my face, but I did not look away. "Only when the stranger deserves it," I said. For the first time the smile on his face grew wider. Not threatening. Not angry. Just entertained. One of the men at his table leaned forward slightly like he expected the mood to shift, but the man in front of me simply shook his head in quiet disbelief. "You are either very brave," he said thoughtfully, "or you are very unaware of the situation you are standing in." "Maybe both," I replied. That earned another short laugh from him. He glanced briefly over his shoulder toward the busboy who was still standing beside the table. The young man looked like he wanted to disappear through the floor. The tall man waved his hand once in a small, dismissive motion. "It is fine," he said calmly. "Accidents happen." The busboy blinked twice like he had just been handed a winning lottery ticket, then hurried away toward the kitchen with relief written across his entire face. I watched him go, surprised by the sudden shift. The man turned back toward me. The restaurant slowly began breathing again. Conversations restarted in quiet murmurs. Silverware clinked against plates. But the invisible circle of space around us remained untouched. "You assumed I was humiliating him," the man said. It was not a question. I hesitated. It looked that way. He nodded once like he accepted the answer. "I was asking him if he wanted to finish his shift early. His mother was taken to the hospital tonight. My associate had just told me." My stomach sank slightly. That explained the look on the kid's face earlier. The nervous shaking. The distracted movements. I folded my arms tighter, suddenly feeling less certain about my heroic moment. The man watched the realization pass across my face. Interesting, he said quietly. You defended someone you did not know against someone you clearly assumed was the villain. His gaze sharpened slightly with curiosity. Why? I shrugged lightly. Because someone should. The silence between us returned again, but this time it felt different. Not tense. Curious. Like the entire evening had taken a turn neither of us expected. The man tilted his head again, studying me with growing interest. Clara Bennett, he said slowly. You might be the most unexpected part of my night. For a few seconds neither of us spoke. The restaurant had returned to its usual rhythm around us, but the space between us still felt strangely separate from everything else. I shifted my weight slightly, suddenly aware that I was still standing in the middle of the dining room, holding nothing while every other server continued working. I should probably get back to my tables, I said finally. My voice sounded steadier than I felt. His eyes followed the movement as I gestured toward the other side of the room where two guests were quietly waiting for their check. He nodded once, but did not step aside immediately. Instead, he studied my face with the same calm curiosity that had been there since the moment I repeated the Sicilian phrase. Clara Bennett, he said again, almost like he was committing the name to memory. How long have you worked here? About 8 months, I answered. Long enough to know when a customer is about to complain about the temperature of their wine. That earned another quiet smile from him. One of the men at his table cleared his throat softly, reminding him that the evening had not originally been about a conversation with a waitress in the middle of the dining room. The tall man glanced briefly in their direction, then back at me. You grew up speaking Sicilian? He asked. The question surprised me again. Most people never notice the difference between Sicilian and Italian. My grandmother, I said. She moved to New York from Palermo when she was 17. She made sure I understood every word she said, especially the colorful ones. The man chuckled softly at that. Palermo, he repeated. Beautiful city. Something about the way he said it made me tilt my head slightly. You have been there? His expression changed just a little, not darker exactly, but more thoughtful. When I was younger, he replied. My mother was born there. That explained the Sicilian. I folded my arms again, not quite defensive this time, but thoughtful. So you understood everything I said earlier. Every word, he confirmed calmly. Including the part where you called me arrogant. I winced slightly. In my defense, I thought you were about to ruin that kid's entire week. Your defense is noted, he said with a small nod. Then his gaze moved briefly across the dining room, taking in the quiet activity around us before returning to me again. It is not common, he continued slowly, for someone to speak to me the way you did tonight. I raised an eyebrow. You mean honestly? His smile returned, a little sharper this time, but still amused. Yes, honestly. One of the men at the table leaned closer to another and whispered something I could not hear. They both looked at me with the same curious expression people used when they saw something unusual. In a museum display. I ignored them and looked back at the tall man in front of me. Well, I said lightly, most people probably like their jobs too much to risk insulting a stranger in a suit. That made him laugh again, the sound low but genuine. You are not wrong. I glanced past him toward the kitchen doors where the busboy had disappeared earlier. The manager was watching us nervously from across the bar like he expected the situation to explode at any moment. I exhaled slowly. Look, I said, lowering my voice slightly. If I misjudged the situation earlier, then I am sorry. The words felt strange coming out of my mouth, but they were honest. He studied me for a moment longer, then shook his head once. Do not apologize, he said quietly. It made the evening far more interesting. Then he stepped aside at last, giving me space to pass. As I moved past him toward my waiting tables, I felt his gaze follow me across the room. Not hostile, not uncomfortable, just curious. Like he had just discovered a story he was not finished reading yet. I tried to focus on work after that, but it was harder than it should have been. Normally the rhythm of a dinner shift pulled me back into routine fast. Orders, plates, refills. The steady pattern of a busy restaurant that left no time to think about anything else. But that night the pattern felt slightly off, like a song playing half a second out of sync. I picked up a check folder from table 12 and thanked the couple sitting there before stepping toward the point of sale station near the bar. My hands moved automatically, entering numbers, printing receipts, sliding bills into the black folders we used for every table. Routine usually solved everything. Except this time, I could still feel the weight of someone watching me from across the room. I did not have to look to know exactly where he was standing. Some people carried attention the way others carried cologne. You noticed it whether you wanted to or not. I handed the receipt back to the couple and offered a polite smile before turning toward the next table that needed water. Halfway there, I finally allowed myself a quick glance across the dining room. He was back at his table now, seated again, with the other 3 men. But something about the energy there had changed. The conversation between them had slowed. One of the men was speaking quietly while gesturing toward a folder on the table, but the tall man barely looked at it. His attention drifted across the room instead, directly toward me. Our eyes met for less than a second before I looked away and continued walking. I told myself it did not matter. Customers noticed servers all the time. That was part of the job. But something about his attention felt different. Not intrusive. Not uncomfortable, just deliberate, like he had decided to pay attention and had not changed his mind yet. Clara, the manager whispered sharply from behind the bar as I passed him. I stopped. He leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice like he was sharing a dangerous secret. Do you know who that man is? I followed his glance toward the corner table again. A customer, I said simply. The manager rubbed his forehead like I had just given the most stressful answer possible. That is Adrian DeLuca. The name meant nothing to me at first. I shrugged lightly. Should I know who that is? The manager stared at me for a long moment like he was deciding whether explaining it would make things worse or better. Finally, he exhaled slowly. Let us just say he is not the kind of guest you argue with in 3 different languages in the middle of the dining room. I blinked once. I did not argue, I said. I just repeated something he asked me to repeat. The manager opened his mouth like he wanted to respond, then seemed to think better of it. Across the restaurant, the 4 men at the table began standing one by one. Chairs slid quietly across the floor. The tall man rose last. Adrian DeLuca adjusted the sleeve of his jacket with calm precision before glancing once more around the room. His eyes found me again almost immediately. Not by accident. Never by accident. The manager straightened instantly like a soldier preparing for inspection. I turned slightly toward the bar, pretending to polish a glass while watching from the corner of my eye. Adrian said something quietly to the men beside him, then stepped away from the table. For a second I assumed he was heading toward the exit. Instead, he walked directly toward the bar, directly toward me. The manager went completely silent beside me. Adrian stopped about 3 feet away, his posture relaxed, expression calm as ever. He placed a folded receipt on the counter and slid a credit card across the polished wood surface. Then his eyes lifted to meet mine again with that same thoughtful curiosity. Clara Bennett, he said slowly. You never answered my question from earlier. I frowned slightly. Which question? The faint smile returned. Whether you are brave, he said, or simply unaware of the situation you are standing in. His gaze held mine for another quiet moment before he added softly. I am beginning to think it might be both. I held his credit card for a second longer than necessary, mostly because my brain was still catching up with the conversation. The name Adrian DeLuca was clearly supposed to mean something important, judging by the way my manager had reacted 2 minutes earlier. But the man standing in front of me did not look like someone expecting fear or apologies. He looked curious, calm, patient. I slid the card through the reader and waited for the machine to process the payment while the manager beside me pretended to reorganize a stack of menus that were already perfectly straight. The silence between the 3 of us stretched for a few seconds. Then the receipt printed with a soft mechanical buzz. I tore it free and placed it on the counter with a pen. Adrian glanced down briefly before signing his name in smooth, deliberate handwriting. Even the way he wrote looked controlled, intentional. When he finished, he set the pen down and pushed the receipt back toward me. I picked it up automatically and froze for half a second when I saw the tip amount written at the bottom. It was more than I usually made in an entire shift. My eyes lifted toward him again. That is unnecessary, I said before I could stop myself. The manager inhaled sharply beside me like I had just stepped onto thin ice again. Adrian did not look offended. If anything, he seemed amused by the comment. You defended one of the staff tonight, he replied calmly. Consider it appreciation. I shook my head slightly and slid the receipt back across the counter toward him. I was not defending anyone for money. His eyebrows lifted just a little. Not surprised. Interested. He studied the receipt for a moment before picking it up again. Then he crossed out the tip with one clean line and rewrote a much smaller number underneath. Still generous. Just not ridiculous. Better? He asked. I hesitated, then nodded once. Better. He tucked the card back into his wallet and slipped it into the inside pocket of his jacket. Around us, the restaurant had fully returned to normal now. Glasses clinked. Conversations flowed. Someone near the window laughed loudly at a story I could not hear. But the small bubble of space around the bar still felt strangely focused. Adrian rested one hand lightly on the counter as he looked at me again. You still did not answer the question, he said. I tilted my head slightly. Which one? Whether you are brave, he repeated calmly, or simply unaware of who you are speaking to. I leaned my elbows against the counter and met his gaze directly. Maybe neither, I said. His expression shifted with quiet curiosity. Then what? I shrugged lightly. Maybe I just do not think anyone deserves special treatment because of their last name. The manager beside me stopped moving completely. I could almost hear him calculating the odds of his restaurant losing its liquor license before midnight. Adrian, however, did not look angry. He studied my face for a long moment, then exhaled a quiet breath that sounded suspiciously like another laugh he was trying not to release. Clara Bennett, he said slowly, you have a very unusual way of viewing the world. It keeps life simple, I replied. Everyone is just a person until they prove otherwise. Adrian considered that answer carefully. His gaze drifted briefly across the dining room, taking in the tables, the guests, the warm lights reflecting off polished glass. Then he looked back at me again. And what have I proven so far? He asked. I thought about that question for a second longer than expected. Then I answered honestly, that you listen more than people expect. For the first time that evening his smile faded into something quieter, not amused, thoughtful, like that answer had landed somewhere deeper than the others. Adrian straightened slowly and adjusted the cuff of his jacket again before stepping back from the bar. Interesting, he said softly. Then he paused, looking at me one last time with the same curious attention that had followed me all night. Clara Bennett, he added calmly. I suspect this will not be the last conversation we have. For a moment I thought he would say something else. Instead, Adrian DeLuca gave a small nod, like a man acknowledging the final line of an interesting conversation. Then he turned away from the bar and walked back toward the entrance of the restaurant. The three men who had been sitting at his table were already waiting near the door, standing with the same quiet patience they had shown all evening. One of them opened the door before Adrian even reached it. The night air slipped inside for a second, cool and sharp compared to the warm light of the dining room. Adrian stepped through without looking back. The door closed behind him with a soft click, and just like that the room seemed to exhale. The manager beside me leaned heavily against the counter like someone who had just finished holding his breath underwater for 3 full minutes. Clara, he whispered slowly, do you have any idea how lucky you are? I picked up a clean glass and began polishing it with the towel draped over my shoulder, mostly because standing still suddenly felt awkward. Lucky how? The manager stared at me like I had asked why gravity existed. You challenged Adrian DeLuca in the middle of my restaurant and walked away with a tip instead of a problem. I shrugged lightly. He seemed reasonable. The manager made a sound somewhere between a sigh and a laugh. Reasonable is not the word people usually use for men like that. I finished polishing the glass and placed it back on the shelf. Across the dining room, the busboy from earlier was quietly clearing a table near the window. When he noticed me watching, he gave me a quick grateful nod before returning to work. I nodded back. Whatever misunderstanding had happened earlier, at least one good thing had come from it. The rest of the evening passed quickly after that. Orders came in. Plates went out. A birthday group near the back of the restaurant asked for extra candles and sang loud enough for half the room to join them. By 10:30, the dinner rush had finally started to fade. Chairs scraped softly across the floor as guests began leaving for the night. I was wiping down the last empty table in my section when the busboy approached me again. He looked less nervous now, though his hands still moved a little too fast while stacking plates. Hey, he said quietly. I wanted to say thank you. I frowned slightly. For what? For earlier, he said. You did not have to say anything. I leaned against the table and crossed my arms lightly. Honestly, I thought I was getting you into more trouble. He shook his head quickly. No. Mr. DeLuca already knew about my mom. One of the guys with him had called the hospital earlier tonight. They told him she was stable. He hesitated before continuing. When he asked me if I wanted to leave early, I was too nervous to answer. I thought I was about to lose my job. That explained the panic on his face earlier. I exhaled slowly. Well, I said, next time someone offers you a chance to leave work early, take it. The kid laughed quietly at that and nodded. Then he carried the plates back toward the kitchen. I finished wiping the table and turned toward the bar to clock out for the night. The manager was still there, organizing receipts and checking numbers on the register screen. As I approached, he glanced up at me with a thoughtful expression. You know, he said slowly, people do not usually cross paths with someone like Adrian DeLuca more than once. I slipped my time card into the machine and pressed the button. The screen blinked and confirmed the end of my shift. I pulled the card back out and shrugged lightly. Then tonight was probably a one-time event. The manager did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked toward the restaurant door like he expected it to open again at any moment. Maybe, he said quietly. But something in the way he said it made me wonder if the night was not quite as finished as I thought. By the time I stepped outside the restaurant, it was a little after 11. Manhattan at that hour had a strange kind of energy. Not the frantic rush of the dinner crowd, and not the quiet stillness of early morning either. Just a steady rhythm of headlights, distant traffic, and people walking with purpose under the glow of street lamps. I pulled my jacket tighter around my shoulders and started. Down the block, toward the subway entrance 2 streets away. The night air felt cooler than I expected after hours inside the warm dining room. My shift had left my feet tired, but my mind was still replaying the evening whether I wanted it to or not. Adrian DeLuca. The name kept echoing in the back of my head. I still was not completely sure why my manager reacted the way he did, but something about it suggested the man was far more important than he had seemed sitting calmly at that table earlier. I reached the corner and waited for the traffic light to change, watching a taxi glide through the intersection in front of me. Across the street, a coffee cart was closing for the night, the owner stacking paper cups into neat towers before pulling down the metal shade on the side of the cart. The city was winding down one small piece at a time. The light turned green, and I stepped into the crosswalk. Halfway across the street, a black sedan rolled slowly past the intersection and came to a stop along the curb about 20 feet ahead of me. It was the kind of car you noticed without knowing exactly why. Dark paint polished, so perfectly it reflected the street lights like glass. Tinted windows. Engine still running quietly. I told myself it was just another car waiting for someone to finish a late shift. New York had thousands of them every night. I kept walking. My sneakers tapped lightly against the sidewalk as I passed the parked car. Then the rear passenger window lowered smoothly with a quiet mechanical hum. I stopped. Not because someone called my name. Because I already knew who it would be before I even looked. Adrian DeLuca sat inside the back seat, one arm resting casually against the door, the interior light casting a soft glow across his face. The same calm expression from earlier had returned, like this entire moment was the most ordinary thing in the world. I blinked once. You followed me? I asked. The corner of his mouth lifted slightly. No, he said calmly. I waited. I glanced down the street behind me where the restaurant sat half a block away, its windows glowing warmly against the dark sidewalk. That sounds suspiciously similar. Adrian shook his head once, amused. I simply wanted to finish. A conversation. The car engine hummed quietly while we looked at each other across the small distance between the curb and the sidewalk. I folded my arms lightly against the cool night air. You had plenty of chances to do that inside the restaurant. Inside the restaurant, he replied calmly. There were too many people listening. That answer made me pause. The city noise drifted around us. A bus rumbled somewhere in the distance. Someone laughed on the opposite side of the street. But the small pocket of space beside that car suddenly felt oddly quiet. Adrian leaned slightly closer to the open window. Tell me something, Clara Bennett, he said. Do you always walk home alone this late? I raised an eyebrow. Do you always ask strangers personal questions from the back seat of a car? The faint smile returned again. Only the interesting ones. I hesitated for a moment before answering honestly. The subway station is 2 blocks away. Adrian considered that answer like it contained more information than the words themselves. Then he reached forward and opened the car door. Get in, he said calmly. I will have my driver take you home. I stared at him. You cannot possibly think I am getting into a stranger's car at midnight. He did not argue. He did not insist. He simply studied my face again with that same thoughtful curiosity. Then he said quietly, You cursed me in Sicilian tonight without hesitation. Somehow I doubt you are afraid of a car ride. For a moment, I just stood there on the sidewalk, staring at the open car door like it was some kind of test I had not studied for. The warm light from inside the sedan spilled across the pavement, cutting a soft rectangle into the dark street. Adrian DeLuca waited without saying another word. That was the strange thing about him. Most men would have tried to convince me. They would have pushed harder, explained why I should trust them. Adrian simply watched, patient and calm, like the decision had already been made somewhere in his mind, and he was just waiting for me to catch up to it. I folded my arms tighter against the cool night air and tilted my head slightly. You realize how this looks, right? I said. A man waits outside a restaurant for a waitress and invites her into a car after midnight. Adrian considered that for a moment, then nodded once. Yes. I blinked. That is your entire defense. The corner of his mouth lifted again. Honesty tends to simplify situations. I glanced down the quiet street toward the subway entrance 2 blocks away. A train rumbled somewhere underground, the vibration traveling faintly through the sidewalk beneath my shoes. If I kept walking, I would be home in about 20 minutes. If I stepped into that car, the entire night would take a direction I could not predict. I looked back at him. You waited all this time just to offer me a ride? Adrian rested his arm lightly along the open door. Partly. What is the other part? He did not answer immediately. Instead, he glanced out toward the street for a second, watching a pair of pedestrians pass by on the opposite sidewalk. Then his eyes returned to me. You are the first person in a long time who spoke to me tonight without calculating what they might gain from it, he said calmly. That is unusual. I frowned slightly. You waited outside for that reason? Curiosity, he corrected. I could not help smiling a little at that. You waited in a car for curiosity. Yes. I exhaled slowly and looked back at the open door again. The interior looked exactly like you would expect. Clean leather seats. Soft lighting. Quiet. No mysterious figures hiding in the shadows. Just a driver in the front seat who stared straight ahead like a statue carved into the dashboard. I leaned slightly closer to the window and looked at Adrian again. You understand that if I get in this car, it does not mean you suddenly control the conversation. Adrian's expression did not change, but the faint amusement returned to his eyes. Clara Bennett, he said calmly. If I believed I controlled this conversation, I would not have opened the door. That answer caught me off guard for half a second. The city noise drifted around us again. A taxi passed through the intersection. Somewhere behind me, a door slammed shut in a nearby apartment building. Life in Manhattan continued without paying the slightest attention to the strange moment happening beside that car. I looked down the street one more time toward the subway entrance. Then I sighed quietly and shook my head. This is probably a terrible idea, I said. Adrian did not disagree. I stepped forward anyway. The leather seat felt cool as I slid inside and pulled the door closed behind me. The city noise softened instantly, replaced by the quiet hum of the engine. Adrian gave a small nod toward the driver in the front seat. Queens, he said simply. The driver nodded once and eased the car away from the curb. I turned slightly toward Adrian as the street lights began sliding past the window beside us. Just so we are clear, I said, this still does not mean I trust you. Adrian leaned back slightly in his seat, his calm gaze meeting mine again. Of course not, he replied. Trust would make this conversation far less interesting. The car moved smoothly through the late-night streets of Manhattan, the city lights sliding across the window like reflections on dark water. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. The quiet inside the car felt different from the quiet outside. Outside there were horns, footsteps, distant traffic. Inside there was only the low hum of the engine and the faint sound of tires rolling over asphalt. I leaned slightly toward the window, watching a row of closed storefronts pass by. When I finally glanced back at Adrian, he was studying me again with the same calm attention he had shown all evening. Not intrusive, just observant. You are unusually comfortable getting into a car with someone you claim not to trust, he said after a moment. I shrugged lightly. I am unusually comfortable leaving a car whenever I want. That earned the faintest smile from him. Fair point. The driver turned left at the next intersection, merging onto a wider avenue where the street lights stretched in long golden lines down the center of the road. I folded my hands in my lap and looked at Adrian again. So, I said, this curiosity of yours. What exactly are you curious about? Adrian considered the question carefully before answering. You, he said simply. I laughed quietly. That is a broad topic. You insulted a stranger tonight without hesitation, he replied calmly. Then you apologized when you believed you were mistaken. That combination is rare. I tilted my head slightly. Honesty is not that rare. It is, Adrian said quietly. Especially when power is involved. The city outside shifted again as the car crossed a bridge, the dark river reflecting scattered lights from buildings along the shore. For a moment neither of us spoke. Then I looked back at him. You keep saying things like that, I said. Like people are afraid to talk to you. Adrian's expression did not change, but something thoughtful flickered behind his eyes. Most people are careful, he replied. Careful usually means they want something. And you think I do not? I asked. Adrian leaned back slightly against the seat, his gaze steady. If you did, you would have chosen a different opening sentence tonight. I laughed again, remembering the Sicilian phrase that had started the entire evening. That was not exactly my most strategic moment. No, Adrian agreed. But it was honest. The car slowed slightly as the driver navigated through another intersection. I watched the lights outside for a moment before speaking again. You still have not answered something, I said. Why Queens? Adrian looked mildly surprised. You told me earlier your grandmother raised you there. I blinked once. You remembered that from a 10-second conversation. I tend to remember details, he said calmly. I leaned back into the seat, studying him more carefully now. The way he spoke. The way he watched the road occasionally, even though he was not the one driving. Everything about him suggested someone used to understanding a room before anyone else did. You are not what I expected, I admitted. Adrian lifted an eyebrow slightly. From a man you assumed was arrogant 20 minutes after meeting him? Exactly, I said. He smiled faintly again. Expectation is a dangerous thing, he replied. It often prevents people from seeing what is actually in front of them. The car continued forward, leaving Manhattan behind as the skyline slowly shifted in the rear window. I crossed my arms lightly and looked at him again. So let me guess, I said. You waited outside the restaurant, invited a stranger into your car, and drove across the city because you enjoy philosophical conversations with waitresses. Adrian's gaze met mine calmly. No, he said. I raised an eyebrow. Then why? The faint smile returned once more. Because, he said quietly, something tells me tonight was not an accident. The car continued moving through the quiet streets of Queens, the buildings outside gradually changing from tall glass towers to older brick apartments and small corner stores with metal gates pulled down. For the night, the city felt different here. Slower. Familiar. I watched the passing streetlights for a moment before turning back toward Adrian. Not an accident. I repeated. Adrian rested his arm lightly along the door beside him, his posture relaxed but his eyes still sharp with that constant awareness. No, he said calmly. People meet each other every day. Most of those meetings disappear as quickly as they happen. Tonight did not feel like one of those. I leaned back slightly in the seat, studying him again. You believe in fate? Adrian considered that word carefully. I believe in patterns, he replied. And tonight had an unusual one. I laughed quietly. Let me guess. A waitress insults you in Sicilian, and suddenly the universe is sending you a message. The faint smile returned to his face. Something like that. I shook my head slightly and looked back out the window. A small grocery store passed by, its neon sign flickering above the door even though the shop itself was closed. You are reading too much into it, I said. Sometimes people just say what they are thinking. Exactly, Adrian said softly. I turned back toward him. And that is what makes it unusual. The driver slowed the car slightly as we approached another intersection. The red traffic light washed the interior of the car with a faint crimson glow for a moment before changing back to green. Adrian watched the road ahead briefly before speaking again. Most conversations I have during the day follow the same script, he said. Careful words. Careful smiles. Careful distance. Because of who you are, I said. It was not a question. Adrian nodded once. Yes. I folded my arms lightly and tilted my head. And you are tired of that. I am aware of it, he corrected. There is a difference. I thought about that for a second. So tonight you found something refreshing. Adrian's gaze returned to me again. Tonight someone spoke without measuring the consequences first. I smiled slightly. You make it sound heroic. No, he said calmly. Just honest. The car slowed again as we entered a quieter neighborhood. I recognized the street immediately. The small park on the corner. the bakery that opened at 6 every morning. My apartment building sat halfway down the block beside a row of narrow brownstones. The driver pulled the car smoothly toward the curb. The engine remained running as the vehicle came to a gentle stop beneath a street lamp. I glanced toward the building entrance about 30 feet away, then back at Adrian. "Well," I said quietly, "this is my stop." Adrian nodded once, but did not reach for the door immediately. Instead, he studied my face again with the same thoughtful expression he had worn for most of the night. "Clara Bennett," he said slowly, "do you know what the most interesting part of tonight was?" I raised an eyebrow slightly. "Let me guess. The Sicilian insult." Adrian shook his head once. "No," the faint smile returned again. "The fact that you never once asked what I do." I blinked. He was right. Somewhere between the restaurant and the ride across the city, I had completely skipped the most obvious question. I leaned slightly toward the door handle and smiled faintly. Maybe I preferred the mystery. Adrian's quiet laugh filled the car again for a brief moment. Then he nodded toward the building entrance outside the window. "Good night, Clara Bennett." I opened the door and stepped out onto the sidewalk. The cool night air returned instantly, carrying the distant sound of traffic from the next avenue over. I closed the door and leaned down slightly toward the open window. Adrian was still watching me with that calm, curious expression. "Good night, Adrian DeLuca," I said. For a second, neither of us moved. Then the driver shifted the car gently back into motion, and the black sedan rolled slowly down the street, disappearing around the corner while I stood beneath the street lamp, wondering why something told me that conversation was far from finished. For a long moment after the car disappeared around the corner, I remained standing under the street lamp outside my building. The quiet of the neighborhood settled around me again, the kind of calm that only showed up after midnight when most of the city had finally decided to sleep. A breeze moved gently down the block, rustling the leaves of the small trees planted along the sidewalk. I exhaled slowly and turned toward the entrance of my building. The old brick steps creaked slightly under my shoes as I climbed them and pushed open the glass door. Inside, the hallway lights buzzed softly overhead. The building smelled faintly like laundry detergent and someone's late night cooking from one of the upstairs apartments. It was ordinary, comfortingly ordinary. I climbed the 2 flights of stairs to my apartment, the familiar rhythm of the steps grounding me after the strange night I had just experienced. When I finally unlocked my door and stepped inside, the small space greeted me with the quiet clutter of a life lived on a modest budget. A couch that had clearly seen better days. A tiny kitchen with a kettle sitting beside the sink. A bookshelf full of paperbacks my grandmother used to read before she passed away. I slipped off my shoes and set my bag on the counter before walking over to the window that overlooked the street. From here I could see the same street lamp where the car had stopped earlier. The curb was empty now, just a quiet stretch of pavement under soft yellow light. I leaned my shoulder against the window frame and let the silence settle for a minute. Adrian DeLuca. The name sounded different now that the evening had ended. Less like a stranger's introduction and more like the start of something I could not quite explain yet. I shook my head lightly and pushed away from the window. It had been one unusual night. Nothing more. People crossed paths in New York every day. Millions of them. The odds of seeing him again were probably close to zero. I walked into the kitchen and filled the kettle with water before setting it on the stove. The soft click of the burner filled the quiet apartment while I leaned against the counter and stared at the steam beginning to rise. A few minutes later, I carried a mug of tea back to the living room and sank into the corner of the couch. The warmth of the cup felt good in my hands after the cool night air outside. My phone buzzed softly on the coffee table beside me. I frowned slightly and picked it up. A new message notification blinked on the screen from an unknown number. For a second, I just stared at it. Then curiosity won. I opened the message. The text was short. Only one line. "Good night, Clara Bennett." I blinked once. Then twice. There was no name attached to the number, but I already knew exactly who had sent it. I leaned back slowly against the couch cushions and stared at the screen. The city outside my window continued its quiet midnight rhythm while the glow of the phone lit the room faintly in my hand. After a few seconds, I typed a reply. "Good night, Adrian DeLuca." My finger hovered over the send button for a moment before I pressed it. The message disappeared from the screen, and the room returned to silence again. I placed the phone down on the table beside me and leaned my head back against the couch, staring at the ceiling. Somewhere in the distance a train passed along the elevated tracks, its low rumble echoing through the neighborhood. I could not explain why, but something about that message made the entire evening feel less like a coincidence and more like the first page of a story that had only just begun. I woke up later than usual the next morning. Sunlight was already slipping through the blinds and stretching across the living room floor when I opened my eyes. For a moment, I just lay there on the couch, staring at the ceiling and trying to remember why my mind felt strangely restless. Then the events of the night before returned all at once. The restaurant. The Sicilian phrase. Adrian DeLuca, sitting calmly in the back seat of that black sedan, like he had been part of my evening all along. I sat up slowly and rubbed a hand across my face before reaching for the phone on the coffee table. The screen lit up instantly. No new messages. Just the quiet confirmation that the last conversation I had before falling asleep had actually happened. I set the phone back down and stood up, stretching slightly as I walked toward the kitchen. Outside the window, the neighborhood had already come to life. A delivery truck rumbled past the corner bakery. Someone walked a small dog along the sidewalk beneath the same street lamp where the car had stopped the night before. Everything looked normal again. Ordinary. I poured myself a cup of coffee and leaned against the counter, watching the morning unfold through the window while steam curled slowly upward from the mug in my hands. Part of me expected the strange feeling from last night to fade once daylight arrived. But it did not. Something about the conversation with Adrian lingered in my mind like an unfinished thought. I shook my head slightly and reached for my bag sitting near the door. Another shift started in a few hours. Life had a way of moving forward whether a mysterious man in a black sedan had appeared in it or not. By the time I arrived at the restaurant that afternoon, the lunch crowd had already begun to fill the dining room. The familiar sounds returned quickly. Plates clinking. Coffee cups sliding across tables. The steady rhythm of a place that never truly slowed down. I tied on my apron and stepped behind the bar where the manager was reviewing the reservation list for the evening. He looked up the moment he saw me. "Clara," he said slowly, studying my face with an odd expression. "Something interesting happened this morning." I frowned slightly. That sounds ominous. He turned the reservation book toward me and tapped one name written neatly in the margin beside tonight's dinner seating. My eyes followed his finger to the line. Adrian DeLuca. 6 guests. 8 o'clock. For a second, I just stared at the page. The manager folded his arms and leaned back slightly. "Looks like your unusual night was not a one-time event after all." I exhaled slowly and closed the reservation book. The restaurant buzzed quietly around us while the reality of the moment settled in. Adrian DeLuca was coming back. Not by accident. Not by coincidence. On purpose. I picked up a tray of glasses from the counter and headed toward the dining room, the faintest smile appearing before I could stop it, because one thought had already settled clearly in my mind. If he was returning tonight, then the story that began with a whispered Sicilian insult was definitely not finished yet.